It's no secret. It's plain to see. And I love you. And you love me. It's no secret. You know it's true.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Hi, Jeffrey.
Hi, Susan. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing well, thank you.
Good. I'm just going to do a couple little housekeeping things and then I will be ready.
Okay.
Okay, very good. And we'll go ahead and you're going to broadcast that, Amber. Did you? All right. I think we are good to go. All right. Get my notes here and we're all set. Hello, Firesiders, and welcome everybody to Adventures by the Book, where our mission is to connect people and communities through the power of books. I'm your host, Susan McBeth, and I'm delighted and honored to be here for part 3 of our 5-part series, Conversations in Race, with award-winning author and Emmy award-winning television director Jeffrey Blount. We are here discussing his book, The Emancipation of Evan Walls, which is a powerful novel that we are going and have been learning intimately over these last few weeks, and will continue for 2 more sessions after this, so we can partake in an interactive conversation about race by using the characters in Jeffrey's book as a touchstone for different perspectives on race. Now, the first 2 weeks, we focused on the protagonist, Evan Walls, and his parents. Today, we're going to focus on the 2 and only positive forces in his life and supporters, Bojack and Mama Jenny. Let me go over a little bit for those of in the audience who are joining us for the first time. I hope we have some repeats who have been coming to every session. But for those of you who are new, let me give a little background again about Jeffrey. He's an award-winning author of 3 novels, Almost Snow White, Hating Heidi Foster, and The Emancipation of Evan Walls. And I have to say, we just hosted an event live and in person with Jeffrey in San Diego. And a teacher had contacted us from New Hampshire and said she was so taken by his book, Hating Heidi Foster, it's a young adult book, that she wanted to teach an entire session to her classroom. And the readers at the event immediately purchased 25 copies of the book so we could send it to the school, donate it, and they could have a conversation with Jeffrey about race in their classroom, which I thought was just brilliant. So if anybody wants to do that, Jeffrey is available to do book club visits and talks with schools and organizations. If you want to schedule him for a book club visit for your own book club or your group, you can go to novelnetwork.com and do so. He's also an Emmy award-winning television director and a 2016 inductee into the Virginia Communications Hall of Fame. During a 34-year career at NBC News, he directed a decade of Meet the Press, The Today Show, NBC Nightly News, and major special events. He's also an award-winning documentary scriptwriter for films and interactives that are now on display in the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. He's got many, many awards and accolades and credentials, and we could spend the entire time just talking about all those, but we really want to get into the discussion. So, Jeffrey, for those who are joining us for the first time, or for those who may have forgotten some of the details over the last week, can you kind of give just a brief synopsis of this book, The Emancipation of Evan Walls, to get our conversation started?
Absolutely. Evan is a 10-year-old boy who is inspired by the rant of the character Bojack, who we're going to talk about tonight, to believe that education is a way to escape some of the issues that his community, his African American community, has been experiencing in the town of Canaan, Virginia. So he wants to go to school and he wants to become somebody, and he believes that he can do it in school. In 1968, when we meet him as he's 10 years old, he would not be surprised to find that many people in the white community would not be attuned to his dream and wouldn't want him to succeed and didn't think he belonged on the intellectual level with white kids when schools integrated. But he was incredibly surprised and hurt to find that many people in his own community felt like what he was doing was somehow wrong, was somehow color coded white, that to be intellectually inclined was to be acting white. And so this 10-year-old boy begins a journey between two very different cultures, each trying to steal his dream from him and make him realize that he is not worthy of that dream, and that he should give it up. And we find these two characters, Mama Jenny and Bojack, coming into his life in order to help him achieve his goal, but also, enlighten us about the world that Evan lives in and the world that we live in, and how, unfortunately, some of the same issues exist.
Yes, and it's a powerful novel. I highly encourage everybody to read it if they have not already done so. I do want to remind folks that this is intended as an interactive conversation about race. So we encourage you to join us on stage at any time that you have a question, a comment. Don't be afraid to ask anything, to share anything. We really want this to be an interactive dialogue, and you can do so by clicking on that little black circle in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Invite yourself up on stage. You can also go to that same little black circle and click on the globe, which allows you to broadcast that to your social media outlets, because this is an important conversation about race that we want to encourage more people to participate in. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So Evan Walls is, as Jeffrey mentioned, the young boy who's struggling with this. Last week, we talked about his parents and how he became a pariah, not only in his community, but with his own parents and his family. This week, we're going to talk about the two people who have meant the most to him, who are his biggest supporters. And let's start with Mama Jenny, who is his 90-ish-year-old grandmother. So
Great grandmother.
tell us a little bit about Mama Jenny and her background, Jeffrey.
Mama Jenny is an icon in the African American community of Canaan, Virginia. She's one of the oldest people, oldest Black people living in the town, and she's well respected for just getting to that age and having to have lived through all that she had to live through as an African American in that time. And she's beloved for her fire that she has, and we find out that through Evan, she's beloved for her heart and her willingness to give, and her strength to stand through some of the things that she explains, to come through some of the things that she explains to Evan that she had to deal with as a Black woman of that age. Given that it was in the 60s and she was in her 90s, you realize she's born in the 1800s, the late 1800s. And so she's seen a lot of issues with regard to race coming, being a child of a slave, coming into Jim Crow, living through all that. And she's bringing all that to the table when she talks to Evan.
But the interesting thing is, she's lived through 90 years of some really harsh, difficult, horrible circumstances, but she doesn't talk a lot about that except to Evan. And the two are like so close and so supportive. Why is it that she chooses to tell a little boy about all her background rather than, her own daughter and son and the rest of the family?
Well, when I created this character, I knew I needed someone, first of all, who could demonstrate unconditional love, because, as you said, that was not in his home. And in my opinion, that any child going through any situation, and particularly this situation, needs someone in their life with unconditional love that is not there to judge, not there to punish, but there to help them. The wisdom of years lived is the best gift you can give to a child sometime. And Mama Jenny brings that to the table. What she also brings to the table is the history of Black folks in Canaan and the history of Black folks in the country. And she talks to Evan about those things, and she talks to the reader. And I did this on purpose because the reader has to be educated about what Evan is trying to escape and has to be educated about how difficult um, the journey is. Mama Jenny has already indicated when Evan goes to meet her, she talks about him asking all these questions all the time, like a Philadelphia lawyer or something. But she laughs about that. She's in love with his intellect. She's in love with his spirit. She's in love with the fact that he's in love with her. And I think that Mama Jenny feels that love, and there really isn't anybody else in her life. I mean, there are people we find out when she's in the hospital. There are people who are there to take things and get things from her. But Evan is the one character in her life who loves her, who shows her the unconditional love that she is showing him. And I think that there's such an incredible love for him, an incredible hope for him, that she wants to tell him the truth. So we have today, you hear Black families talk about the the conversation, when particularly dealing with police officers. You have to have the conversation about what you do. Well, Mama Jenny has these conversations with Evan because she knows he's at that point where he needs to hear the truth. Because he knows he has to know what he's going to be dealing with, and he has to know that she's going to be there. But these are conversations of warning, conversations of instruction, and conversations of love. And so I think it's a mutual loving society. I needed someone that loved Evan and someone that he could love as much. And that's why Mama Jenny is there, and that's what she brings to the table. But it's so important. It's really, really important. It was for me to have her be a kind of historian, a general historian. Bojack is more of a Canaan historian, but she's a general historian about what it is to be Black in Canaan, what it is to be Black in America, what Black children or what's left out of their education. She talked about the fact that Black kids didn't even know who Paul Robeson was. He didn't know who Paul Robeson was, and we find that truth later on when we'll talk about the character Patty Cunningham in another week. But she exposes Evan to Black writers. So there are all these things that Evan doesn't know, being a Black child, that you think he should know. Mama Jenny knows some of that. And she knows in order for him to take the next step, she has to give all of that to him.
But she doesn't know everything, yet he feels like she does know everything because she's even his moral compass. I mean, she quotes the Bible a lot, and whenever and you think of a young child, traditionally they're not necessarily comfortable talking to adults about their issues, but he talks to her and she uses the Bible kind of as uh, her, I don't know, what do you want to call it, her reference manual.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And he refers to her saying, Mama Jen is just like the Bible. If you ask her a question, a question with a moral issue, she'll have an answer like the Bible. So yeah, he that's just a part of many older African American folks that I grew up around. And religion was paramount in the community. And so I thought, to be honest and true to the characteristics of folks of that age, that religion had to be there and had to be a big part of their lives, because that's how they got through things. There's a John F. Kennedy where in the first chapter where they all talk about they need John F. Kennedy to get them through. But in truth, it was going to church. In truth, it was believing in faith that if it wasn't going to be a good life here, that they would find a good life afterwards. But faith kept them strong while they were dealing with this life.
And what I thought it was a really poignant scene where Evan asks his grandmother if she is afraid of white people. Can you talk a little bit about that scene, what was discussed, and what just elaborate a bit on that scene?
Well, she wants Evan to know, and Evan wants to know where he stands and how he's going to face things and what he should be worried about. And so because they have this relationship, he just comes out and asks her, are you afraid of white people? And then the reaction before she speaks shows him that she is. He's sad that he's asked the question, but he really wants to know. And after a moment or two of her getting herself together, she tells him that she is. And then she elaborates, and she will do it several times in the book, but she elaborates, she tells him why, because they are in sole control of her life. And she tells him, a story about how she isn't even who he thinks she is. That she was born and given a name, but the mistress of the plantation, who the family was still living on the plantation of sharecroppers, came down and renamed her, and so and she had to accept that name. And so if white people can even it can change your name and change who you are. And then she said they everything you do, they run. If you got to pay a bill, you pay it to them. If you got to get your car fixed, is to them. They live in a society where black people are not business owners, black people are not doctors, and practically everything you do, you are afraid to offend white people because you need them to help take care of your living. And so she tells him that, and it kills her to have to admit to a black child that yes, I'm your adult who you're supposed to be looking up to me, and yes, I am afraid of white people. He needs to have the answer, and she had to be honest with him because she believes he needs to know.
Yeah, and I don't know about you. Are you feel do you feel comfortable talking about your childhood and your relationship with white people? Were you raised to be afraid of white people? Did you feel afraid of white people? Did your parents, have the talk with you? And at what age were you? I'm just curious because I know we talked in, I don't know if it was last session or the session before, but I shared my own experiences, and
Right.
I hate to date myself, but I grew up in the '60s, and
Me too. Me too.
yeah, and I was afraid. I was afraid. I was taught to be afraid of Black people. And so when integration started in our high school in the early '70s, I was deathly afraid. And so I'm curious in the alternative what your experience was, Jeffrey.
Well, I didn't have to be taught. I like to say that black children picked this up by osmosis. So just being around those conversations with black people, like you're sitting on the porch, like in the session statements, the adults talked openly. I mean, they hid very little about what it was to be black and how they responded to um, that white person or this white person or what was done to that black person by that white person. So really, by the time you figure out how to have any perspective about the world, you know your place as a black person, and you know that it's dangerous to be on the wrong side in the '60s in the South of white people. And so um, my parents were also or still are also very religious people. And I think in large part my ability as an adult to see past some of the things that my community tried to instill in me and make friendships and a marriage with white people is my parents um, lesson plan for my brothers and I that every person you meet with an open heart. And then, as I think it was Maya Angelou who says that, when they show you who they are, believe them. So if they show themselves to be racist, then you don't need to be around that person. If they show themselves to be willing to have a civil conversation and be civil with you, you don't trust white people, but you can have that civil conversation and move on. My father was a farmer. There were white farmers in my town who, in the time of harvest, they would end up helping each other harvest to make it through the harvest on time. But then the black farmer would go and get less for his crops. But so my grandfather and my father and my uncles had relationships with white farmers, and that's about as close as I got until schools integrated. I wasn't afraid of white people in the sense that I was afraid they were going to hurt me because I lived a very, very separate life. I think I refer to them in the book as sort of like pink blurs moving on the other side of life and looking at them through heat waves in a desert. Rippling waves. You look through that the air looks to be bent, and you see these people walking on the other side, but you have no relationship with them. My community really tried to let us know as children that you don't trust white people. There are many black people that I grew up around who absolutely hated the ground that white people walked on. People use the word cracker as a term all the time. So I grew up in all of that, and it wasn't until schools integrated that my world collided with the world of white people. So I would say to you that I would be anxious around white people. I would be very quiet when I was with my parents, and my parents were in a store or something and talking to someone white. Um, and if someone white came to the house to work on the house or something, I made myself scarce. So this is how we were taught to be. So I never really had that conversation that people talk about having today. You just grew up in it and lived it and absorbed it and understood where you should be. I have a really good friend who is in her late 80s, who is a white woman who grew up in Smithfield, and we've developed a friendship. And she talks about her growing up as a white woman in this town that I grew up in, and being able to play with the black sharecroppers' children. And then at a certain point, the parents cut it off and said, "That's it. You don't play with anybody because they're black, you're white, you're above them, and this is how it goes." And she never understood that, and it bothered her to the point that at a certain point, she just left. When she got old enough, she moved to New York, so she thought she could get away from some of this stuff. So that's the kind of community I grew up in. There was all sorts of tension in the air that was not reacted on a lot of times because we tried our very best to stay away.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what that must have been like for you. And so, how old do you think you were when you started getting a sense that it was different for people of color?
Oh, I think probably certainly by the time I was in first grade, I understood because I would hear people say, all the time, well, if you were white, it wouldn't be an issue, right? And I would hear my father talk about, the black farmers being treated differently because they were black, and little bits of history started to seep through. I would hear conversations about the civil rights movement. I would hear conversations about, what happened to this black person and how that wouldn't have happened if they were white, or how white people could do certain things to black people. And this was a big one. White person could do whatever they wanted to you, and they were not going to pay for it. This was something that we absorbed right away, and we all knew, and we talked about it as kids. If you were riding a bike somewhere and you thought for a second you might want to go in and get up, or go wherever they would allow you and to get a piece of candy, you thought about whether it was worth it or not. If you said the wrong thing, if you looked at a white adult the wrong way, they could do whatever they wanted, and you knew that, and there was nothing you could do about it. And so there was a lot of apprehension.
How did you grow up to not, or maybe you did have a chip on your shoulder? I mean, given that, that's a heavy load for a child to bear.
Well, one was a lesson my parents taught, which they live by. You greet everybody with an open heart until they show you otherwise. So we did live by that. Um, and before I answer that, I want to tell you one story from my family. If I could tell you about the relationship with black. So we were going to go to McDonald's one day, as a family outing, and it was my middle brother and I were going to go into the McDonald's and order. It was the parents giving us an opportunity to, be grown up and go in and order our own food, order the food for the family. So my brother's 3 years older than I am, and we're given the orders that you say yes, sir, to, if and typically it was a male then in those days, you're going to say yes, sir, and you're not going to leave without a receipt. You have to have a receipt in your hand. So we went in, and there was a kid behind the counter. He couldn't have been more than 13 or something like that. And so my brother would have been like 9, not that much younger. I mean, okay, maybe the kid was 15 given the work rule, but we knew he was a teenager. He was not a man. And so my brother, when he was asking us these things, my brother would say, "Yes, sir." And the guy was looking at my brother, and my brother would say, "Yes, sir. And we want that. Yes, sir." And finally, the kid said, "I'm not a man. You don't have to say sir to me." And my brother said, "Yes, sir." And that
Wow.
tells you what was going on, because he might say that to you, but don't trust that you could then lower your guard and that someone white would then, how that might backfire on you. So those are the lessons that we were taught. Now, I forgot the question that you just asked because I got into that. What was the question that you asked right before that?
I did too. I was thinking it was now I don't even remember myself. I was so
Oh, I'm
engaged in
sorry.
your story. That's okay. That's okay. Um, yeah, I'm just curious about your own. Oh, how you did not develop a chip on your
Oh,
shoulder.
right, right. So I went to when schools were integrated. Um, I was in a class where the majority of the kids were white. Um, I had been a good student in the segregated schools. Um, so I was in this class, and the first few days were terrifically difficult. All of the black kids in that room felt um, besieged because white kids were saying things and they could get away with saying things. And you couldn't ask a black teacher for help in the hallways because they were as afraid as you were. And everything was so uncomfortable. But then I don't even remember how it happened. But there's a guy by the name of Sonny Stanley and white, and we ended up. I don't remember if we were put together and like to do a project together or something. Um, but we started talking to each other. And after you talk to each other for a while, you realize neither one of us had to be afraid of each other. So we brought marbles to school and we played marbles every day at lunchtime. And then other people would join, black kids and white kids. And pretty soon at lunchtime, we had rings. Everybody would, put their rings and the marbles in the rings. And we had interracial group of marble players in the midst of all this. And not that it made everything else good, because there was a lot of other stuff happening at school. But in those moments, I began to realize this kid is not here to hurt me. And he's, in many ways, he feels as vulnerable as I did. I have another white friend, because when our schools were integrated, the like I put in Evan Walls is a true thing. So once the schools were integrated, the white community built an academy just for white kids, so that fall the white kids who could afford it wouldn't have to go to school with black people. Well, it made the public schools um, uh, a larger percentage black. I don't remember exactly, but there was more black people now all of a sudden. So if you were white, you were in the minority in the public school. And so another friend of mine said, he was afraid then because all of a sudden he was a minority and everybody was a little bit vulnerable. And kids tend to be sometimes more open. And those relationships in those moments taught me that something was wrong with the whole general idea of hating someone just because they were white. And then there's a part in the Evan Walls book, which is based on something that really happened to me. It's um, a little less. I mean, it's more. There's a lot more to it in real life. But I go to a white friend's home, and his mother greets me at the door. And the response I got from her entering her house um, was amazing to me. And I had to think about all these things. And so by the time I was in middle school, I realized that some people had been lying to me out of their own fear, or maybe they wanted to protect me and they realized that if they made me afraid of white people, then I would be safe. But kids are, you're smart, and you know that at a certain, you can see that these things are not adding up. And so I began to accept that. And then by the time I got on the football team, and some of those guys, including Sonny Stanley, who would be one of my best friends, was on the football team, a lot of those things dropped. And so it became little by little for me experiencing relationships with kids who didn't bring those kinds of things to the table. And then I realized, so I went to Sonny's family's house, and I was invited to his house. And his father was standing outside with us talking to the two of us. And his father said to me, Jeffrey, you're welcome at my house anytime. And you can come into my house anytime. You can have dinner with us. And, we welcome you here as Sonny's good friend. And over time, Mr. Stanley just talked to us about life. And when he would say I want it for Sonny, he would say I want for you too, Jeffrey. He used to say I want to grow up. I want to 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 still be working when Sonny graduates from college because I want to work for him. And he would say I'd be happy to work for you too, Jeffrey. And so I kept saying that. So these things kept hitting me, and I kept saying that something is not right, and I have to start letting down some of these guards so that I can be in a vulnerable place to give something to the friendship that someone is giving to me. So that's how it started for me. And then going off to college and being in a place where there were people from all around the world. By that time, I had opened up my mind, and I was able to accept all of these different groups of folks into my life.
Wow. And I'd love to hear from any audience members who okay. Okay, sorry about that little sound effect I wanted to fix.
Okay.
I want to hear from audience members about their experiences as they were children, is what their experience with race, if they had any, what did their families teach them? What did they personally experience? What were their thoughts on race? So, feel free to invite yourself up any time. But what's mind boggling to me is, I am probably older than most of the people in the audience here, but I am by no means ancient. And Jeffrey, this is during our lifetime. I mean,
Yes,
I went to a initially segregated high school. I mean, these are things that happened to you in your lifetime. I mean, this is
that's
not
right.
ancient history, and this is completely mind-boggling to me that and things are still happening. I mean, it's not even that it's disappeared, and so I think about it, especially when we talk about it, and I think that's why it is important to talk about it, because you forget that it's not ancient history.
That's right. It's not ancient history, and not only that, it still affects us. And we seem to be slipping backwards. When I think I might have mentioned to you, I taught this class at George Washington University, and one of the things I asked the class members, black and white class members, have you ever had? How many raise your hands if you've had a person of the opposite color spend the night at your home? Nobody had, and only one black woman had someone over for her house for to eat a meal with them. I was blown away because back in the 70s, I was eating at Mr. Stanley's house with my friend Sonny, who was white. So it was astounding to me that kids at a university of that level um, could have made it that far and to have lived such a separate life. And I think that's in part some of the issues that we're having today. We're not, oftentimes we're not a part of the same American story. We're living on different sides of the plot line.
Because we have conversation. Well, I don't even want to say we have conversations. We're divisive in our dialogue.
Yeah.
So I think these kind of meaningful conversations are what we need more of. And I see that a couple people have joined us on stage, so I'm going to be quiet so we can talk to them. So I think first
Okay.
up is Amber. Welcome, Amber. Did you have a question or comment for Jeffrey?
Hi, Jeffrey. Can you hear me?
Hi, Amber. Yes, I
It
can.
was so nice to meet you at Superbook. You are a
Likewise,
fantastic
likewise.
speaker, and I
Oh,
love
thank
listening
you.
to you.
Thank you.
Okay, so just a little bit on my background. I actually come from a household with a little bit of diversity. My dad is white, but my mom is Hispanic, and so
Hmm.
I just kind of grew up, like it was normal for me to have like a mom with like different skin color. And a couple times in my life when I was younger, like my mom would get pulled aside and asked if she was my nanny, and just kind of growing up and hearing that, it was really, I didn't understand. And my brothers have darker skin than me, so a lot I would be asked if I was adopted. And it was just kind of like I felt really angry for my mom and my brothers because it wasn't fair for them. And so just for me growing up, I just grew up, you know including everybody, kind of like, I like what you said, where you treat people with kindness and an open heart until they show you otherwise, and I've just grown up with that policy. But my question to you is, I have stopped talking to certain people in my life because they're just racist, and it's really difficult because a lot of them are my relatives on another side of my family, and I don't know how to keep a relationship with them, and I don't know how to talk about these challenging conversations with them. So what do you have any advice for that? And if you do, do you also think that there's hope that they could change or, be open-minded?
Well, I'm not a psychologist, Amber, but I'm going to tell you what my experience is, that it's always possible for someone to see the light and change. But I will tell you that I have folks in my family, extended, not my family I grew up in, but extended family, that feel the same way, or have some of those issues with regard to white people. So my wife is white. There are people you sometimes just have to let go, and because you can't have people dragging you down, or you don't want to live inside of that negativity. And so, I'm not a person, and I know I'm unique, but I'm not a person. People say family is everything. I'm not a family is everything person if family is damaging to you. Um, and so, um, my thoughts are, when people show me who they are, regardless of family or otherwise, and particularly with regard to race, I move away, because it's my belief that there are more people in this country who are like me than there are the opposite. And I tend to want to spend my life in that group, and those people who are willing to be activists in their daily lives, and when it comes to issues in their community, and their nation, in terms of voting, and putting pressure on your legislators and all those kinds of things. I'm more with people who are like-minded in that way. Um, I think sometimes it depends on age. I do know that there were people in my extended family, some older folks, who just could not see the light. They had had so much pain in their lives that I didn't want to diminish their pain. You have to recognize their pain, but I also didn't want to live in the hate they built up. So I think you have to have, if you have an open and honest conversation, and say, here's why I want to have this conversation. Here's why I think you need to have the conversation, and why, in the end, if we all are working towards diversity in our lives, that we can be better. Why do you have you asked yourself why you carry these prejudices, and what you actually get out of it? And if they don't want to answer the questions, or don't want to have the conversation, then if you were my child, I would suggest, go someplace else for a while. Let life happen, and if you want to go back a little later and try it again, you can do that. But don't bog down. Don't get your life bogged down trying to change the lives and mindsets of people who are and it's so deeply ingrained in.
Thank you so much. That's really, it's hard to hear, but it's the truth. So just thank you so much.
You're welcome, and move forward in a positive way. There are many of us who um, that are on your wavelength, and where you can have family that you were born into, and you can have chosen family. So I'll be your chosen family, and we can have those discussions, and we can move through life together that way.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you for the question, Amber. I'm sure a lot of people have the same situation for sure. So Juliet has joined us on stage. Hi, Juliet. Welcome. Did you have a question or comment for Jeffrey?
I do. Can you guys hear me? I'm sitting watching soccer, and I just want to make sure. Oh, you can. Okay, great.
Yes, I
Um,
can.
yes, thank you for having this. This is, it's always a very intriguing conversation, and I'll give a little background about myself as well. So I grew up outside of Philadelphia in a suburb. I'm one of five, but I have an adopted sister from Korea, and I was a baby when she was adopted at 3. And our town was considered upper middle class, but it was diverse. It wasn't like super diverse, but there was there was a mix of there was a number of families that had adopted children as well. There was African American families, there was mixed race families. But if I look back at it now, after being in the city and living in certain areas, it probably wasn't as diverse as in my mind it was. But what you said, which I think is so important and I absolutely love, is I grew up the same way. It was that you look at someone's heart. And in my family, I grew up, fairly religious, Catholic. But
Mhm.
that's how it was. So when I met anyone, and I don't know if it has to do with my sister, because my sister looked different. But anyone that I met, I'm a super curious person. So I would always ask people questions, that, even as a little kid, I would go up to the old person and say, "Oh, your skin's wrinkly," or, "Are you sad?" Like,
Right, right.
I was that person. So I would go up to a black person and say, "I want to touch your hair. I want to do that." So I was very comfortable with who I was, and my parents let me be comfortable. And I was fortunate enough that I was around people that would let me ask questions and touch their hair, and, and all of that. So I feel like, living with the spirituality and the religion of, my family, and I teach my kids the same. It doesn't matter if you're a custodian or a president. It's what's in your heart and who you are. You treat everyone the same. You please and thank you. If someone's serving you, it's the same as if you get a job. So I really grew up that way. And just an interesting side note, I played field hockey and lacrosse. So I went to college. I went to a school in New Jersey. My maiden name is Williams.
Did you go to
And
Princeton?
I did not. I went to
Oh,
Rowan
okay.
University.
Because people in Princeton, they always say, I go to a school in New Jersey because they don't want to say Princeton. So that's why
Oh,
I
no.
asked.
No, Rowan's a great school, but it's not Princeton. A lot of people don't know Rowan. It's a Division
Yeah.
3 school, great school. Actually, it used to be called Glassboro State. It was a teaching school. And then Henry Rowan gave $100 million, and they
Oh,
changed
that'll
the
do it.
name to Rowan University.
Yeah.
Yes. And what was really interesting, so it was down in South Jersey. So it was in Glassboro. And I was put in an upper class dorm, by mistake, but it was also a fully African American dorm. And I walked in and I was like, "Oh, this is interesting, but okay." And I remember my floor, and I was also a freshman, and I was thinking everyone seems a lot older than me, but whatever. And I had already was at school because I played sports. So I was there for probably 2 weeks earlier. And I'll never forget, everyone was cheering on the floor. "Oh, we don't have any white people." And I remember sitting in my room going, "Oh, I don't think they
That's
saw me."
it.
But because I was
Yeah.
comfortable who I was, I remember I poked my head out and I said, "Oh, it's me." And they're like, "You're in the wrong dorm." And I was like, "Well, this is the dorm." And they're like, "Yeah, you're in the wrong dorm." And I remember this one woman, Judy. She had 11 siblings, and I could tell she was not happy I was there. And so that made me want to know her more and talk to her
Right.
more. And finally, one day she said to me, "I've never met a nice white person." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And I went to school in the 90s. So I was like,
Yeah.
"What are you
Yeah.
talking about?" I was so horrified and so upset. And she said, and so one of the other girls was like, "So she's not being mean to you. She just doesn't trust you." And I, again,
Yeah.
was like, I don't think I've ever met anyone that didn't trust me, nor didn't like me. And I'm not saying that to be anything else, but I'm like a really good person. I'm fun. I'm like a nice person. I don't always make, the best life choices, but I treat everyone with respect. So, she finally, I remember to this, she and a group of girls would come to my field hockey games. And she said
Huh.
to me, she said, "I just have to tell you." And she goes, "Not many people can change my mind." She's like, "But your family came a couple times." And she's like, "And the fact that you didn't run home and you were 17, 18 years old, the only white person in a dorm, and you were like, well, I'll just make it work." I wasn't allowed to stay because it was an upperclassman dorm, and they would have parties, and I had to wake up at 6 a.m. and I would yell at them, be like, "Guys, you have to be quiet. I got to get up. I get a game." And that's the other thing she said. I've also never had anyone stand up to tell me to be quiet. And I was like, well, that's me. But what are your thoughts on? I mean, people would say to me, "I can't believe in your like that you there was still a segregated dorm." And from my experience, it wasn't like segregated. It like the African American group they wanted to have a segregated, and I guess there was some other rooms, but maybe it was coming from the university, and I didn't realize it. Do you know what I'm saying? So like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, if it was coming from the university, I kind of I don't particularly agree with that. Um, I mean, I don't think you invite kids to a diverse campus and then segregate them.
Yeah, and so I don't
I
think
don't
it
I don't
was.
see that.
Yeah, and it's a very, I mean, it's a great school, so it's, I would be very surprised, and it's in New Jersey. But now that I'm thinking about it and having this conversation, I'm like, huh, I've never really thought why there. I mean, and the group was excited. They were like, oh, this is great. And I think it was one of the first times they were doing it, and so
Yeah.
I
Well, there could be. I mean, there is a posse program in schools now. There's a I don't know if you've heard of this posse.org, and what they do is that they would take minority candidates. They don't just have to be black; they can be black and Latino or whatever, and they put them together as a group, and they send them to the schools that are participating with the posse program. So they might go to a majority white school in Boston or in upstate New York or something, but they go with a group of students who can be a support network for each other, but they don't end up all together in the same dorm. They have white roommates and other roommates, but they just have this group that can meet to help each other, which I think is perfectly fine. Some sound amiss at your school in the sense that all of them ended up in there, but I do understand their point of view. They're safe, and
right,
and they are afraid of not the fact that you're one white person, but a white woman in particular, with the privilege that we were taught white women have, is something to fear. And we've seen it. We saw the guy stand in Central Park and the woman on the phone all the way across from him.
right,
He's not even a threat, and she knows she can say, "Oh, he's black and he's threatening me," and people will do something about it. So we were white women. You stayed away from that situation because when they scream, the world will come, and that would be the end of it. So I think they felt comfort and peace in being in that dorm. I will tell you, I gave and again, I think something sad about that situation that the school that they ended up in there at a diverse school. They should have been, in my opinion, in a diverse dorm. But I would speak to high schools here in Washington D.C. and I would speak to African American students, and I became good friends with a counselor who would have me come and speak to some of the kids. And she told me this story about one of her students, and they live in a black neighborhood in Washington D.C. And the kids oftentimes never get out of the neighborhood. They don't go to the museums. It's amazing how limited they are. So she goes off. This one student goes off to school and has a white roommate. And the part of the whole first semester, this young woman had come undone because she was in this room. She couldn't sleep. She thought this white girl was going to kill her. She thought all these things were in her mind, and the counselor had to really talk her down. So by the end of the first semester, as they started the second semester, um, the roommate finally got across to her that I'm just here to go to school. I don't mean to cause you any trouble, and it'd be nice if we could get together. And the counselor had talked her down off her ledge that she was actually able to build a relationship with that person. So you said in the 90s, this was in the 90s too. So imagine that. Imagine growing up in the 1990s and feeling that much fear about being in a situation with a white child your age. And where did that come from? They have absorbed the same fears. And Susan asked me about being, young and black in the South in the 60s. They're absorbing the same fears 30 something years later and reacting to them in much the same way, just being very, very fearful because they believe that this person has ability to do things to their lives and they can't protect themselves. And that's a major, major issue with regard to race. So I'm happy that you are the person you are, that you feel comfortable being yourself, and that you are accepting of people and letting people to show you who they are, because I do believe that's how we create friendships and move forward. I think it speaks volumes to who you are, who you were in that situation, that they would come to your game to see you play.
oh, it was it.
I think you turned a major corner there, and I think that I smile about that. I love that.
That was amazing. And I mean, Judy and I stayed in touch for a very, very long time too. She had cancer, and so she didn't live for very. But it
Yeah.
was um, it was an experience, but as I guess someone that, and I don't, I know that this is not the right thing to say, but not blind to color, but like my sister was Asian and people would say, who is she? And I would say,
Right.
my sister. Like I would look at them and I'd be like, what are you talking about? And they were like, she doesn't look like you. And I'm like, yeah, we kind of do, like that's the kind of kid I was. So it just wasn't like that. But, and I have to look into it now that I also throw my college because it's a good university. I need to look back and do a little bit more research on that because I would love to know. Again, it could have been just my memory because it was like my floor and it was like you're not supposed to be here kind of thing. Like you're first of all
Right.
you're young and here, and then it was like, oh, you got misplaced because your last name is Williams, and I was like, this is so confusing and this is so weird. Like I just think this is crazy. So I don't want to throw the university under the bus. There could, there might have been a very logical reason, but maybe not. And so I'm going to do a little research on that, and I'll get back to you guys. But thank you for this conversation, and thank you, Susan and Jeffrey for having me up.
Thank you, Juliet.
Thank you, Juliet, for sharing your personal experiences. We really appreciate that. And now we have been joined by The Real. Okay, welcome, The Real. Did you have a question or comment to make?
Actually, I have a question, more or less. I was going to ask if he has heard of the Wampanoag tribe.
Oh yeah,
I'm Native,
absolutely.
I'm Native American, and I've asked a lot of people, and a lot of people have no idea. And that's one of the big things going on currently in the United States. That's a big battle behind the scenes. Of course, everything else kind of is taking precedence over it as
Yeah.
far as the media is concerned. But I wondered if you knew anything about that.
I do in part because when I was growing up as a kid, I got a job as a cub reporter at my hometown newspaper, and one of the guys there was very much into the West. He loved the history of the West, and so
Hmm.
he gave me some Time magazine books about the West. And by the time I went to college, I had become very interested, and I was taking sociology courses on being Black in America, and taking sociology courses on the Native American perspective. I only had one Native American friend in college who could give me like first person perspective, but this is from books.
Hmm.
I went on digs and began to study Native American tribe and tribal cultures and I don't profess to be a great historian, but I know that tribe. And yeah, so and as far as you know, in the original Constitution, when we talk about the story of our nation, 39 white men signed that document, as if nobody else existed or had an influence on what was happening in the country. So, you know how many times the word woman was written in the Constitution? Zero
That many.
times. And what Native Americans, what indigenous people got was a few words to say they couldn't be taxed, meaning they were not citizens. And so all of a sudden, people who had been here long time before the Europeans got here were now, foreigners in their own land.
Right.
And this has been the mentality about Native American culture from the dominant culture as we move right alongside of what's happening in the Black community. We move right
Hmm.
alongside of the women's movement. But you're right. I mean, when Standing Rock, when the water issue happened just a year and a half or so ago, um,
Yeah.
people were coming to that totally cold, had no idea what was happening in there. People don't know about what happened at Wounded Knee.
Hmm.
All of those things. Um, I agree that the Native American struggle is oftentimes on the back burner, and it was an amazing thing to me that Biden did in putting a Native American, an indigenous woman, as head of the Department of Interior, which I thought was a great statement for him. But you are
Hmm.
absolutely 100% right that we need to pay more attention to what is going on with indigenous folks in our country.
Well, we lost so much of our identity through the years,
Yeah.
and when you go back into the history books, the things they don't teach you in schools, like the Wampanoag, were the ones actually who interacted with the Pilgrims
Right.
originally,
Right.
and were the ones that were even slaughtered for that
Yeah.
on what we traditionally now call Thanksgiving.
That's right. Yeah.
And there's so much more history to it that we're not taught. We're taught, I was taught in kindergarten, you know, trace the outline of your hand and make a turkey out of it. And that's what,
Hmm.
and Thanksgiving was about that and food and the pilgrims, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
And
right.
and there's so many, like the actual story um, is way different. And like I
It
said,
is.
we've lost so much of our identity because of that. It's
It is
been,
it is way different. But I was encouraged a little bit, and I'm speaking. I'm not a Native American, and so and you can call me on that. But I was happy a little bit in the last couple of Thanksgivings that people are trying to tell that story, and
yeah,
people are actually giving a different name to Thanksgiving in some families and stuff because they're trying to recognize the fact that this wasn't we haven't this is goes back to again to if you want to call the Constitution our roadmap, our original chapter, we started telling the story wrong from the beginning and leaving out all
mhm,
these characters that should be in the book, including the Native American experience. And it's also like we have misinformation in that American story. The whole thing about Columbus, and now we learn the truth about Columbus, but we've been lied to all that time. It's like George Washington in the cherry tree. There's so many misleading factors in our history. So I'm thankful for you for raising that. I appreciate you for raising that, and I stand with you. And you know, and my and there's if you look up my name and you look up thegrio.com, you can
mhm.
read an article I wrote about this, and it's generated by the name of the football team here in Washington who has recently changed. But if you look up Jeffrey Blount and thegrio.com, you can see how I felt about treatment of Native Americans in that op-ed piece.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I will look that up. And I appreciate you guys having me up. Like I said, there's almost nobody I have talked to knows anything about the Wampanoag, which is such a rich history, and it actually does intertwine with the African American history,
Yeah, it does.
predating the Civil War even. So,
Yeah,
and
and, so,
and
and
go
oh,
ahead.
and I was going to say, and so I suggest to you that you use your voice. I think the more people speak out and call this issue out, it's all the better. So in any way that you can find to use your voice, or if you want to write an op-ed piece or you want to start speaking about it, get out there and let people know.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate your time.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for coming up and
And
sharing your thoughts with us. And
thank you, Susan.
it just reminds me that we have so many more conversations to have about this topic.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on stage. And I know that our time is winding down. We didn't even get a chance to talk to Bojack. So I don't know if we want to carry that over until next week. I don't know if anybody has any final thoughts. They want to jump on stage. Here's your last chance before we sign off for the week. What do you think, Jeffrey? We want to talk about Bojack next week a little bit?
We can do that. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right. Because we only have a few minutes left, and I don't want to start the conversation that
yeah, yeah,
and go over for everybody's time. But
yeah. Well,
so next week,
he can certainly blend into those characters, the next characters.
yeah.
Yeah.
So next week we are meeting on Friday, March 11th. That was the only day we all had free. So a little change of date, but we are going to continue part 4 of our 5-part series, Conversations in Race. We will talk about Bojack a little bit, but we're also going to talk about Lost Boy and Mark. So Bojack will be the other positive influence, a
Right.
really strong. I think he deserves more than just a few minutes in winding down today. So I want
Yeah.
to get into him in more depth. And then we'll talk about Lost Boy and Mark next week as well. So any closing thoughts?
No, I'm just happy like you, I'm happy to have these conversations. It makes me feel good to have people open to hearing the conversation and participating in the conversation. I thank Amber and Juliet and the Real for opening our eyes further about the conversation, recognizing that there is more to the American story than just the black and the white story. I think it's generated so much of our, or taken up so much space in our history because of slavery and the uniqueness of the American slave years and the legacy. It's because, the third rail of the American politics and Jim Crow and all of those things. But it certainly it does not. There's no. We don't have a moral upper hand when it comes to suffering indignities and mistreatment. And so certainly our African American brothers and sisters deserve an equal recognition of the struggle that they've had in our nation.
And conversation far beyond Black History Month, 28 days in February.
Absolutely.
We are going to March and still conversing, and we want to continue that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you. So next Friday, part 4. And if you want to follow Jeffrey on Fireside, you just click on his icon, follow him so that anytime he is on Fireside, you'll get notice of that. If you want to click on my logo, anytime we are on with an adventure by the book, which is mostly every week, you can get notice of that. And I want to thank you all for joining us today, those who are listening in live from our public profile page or social media channels, and those of you in the virtual audience, and especially those of you who shared your thoughts and comments with us today. Thank you, Jeffrey, for another enlightening week, and we will see you all next
Susan.
week. Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.